Just the facts, ma'am.
Welcome to part 3 of Saving America. This is our segment that we call Just the Facts, and we've got a great guest for you today, Dr. Paul Sambataro, and he is a neurocognitive scientist and author. He's got some fascinating research on human behavior, and he's the head of the Houston Behavioral Health Institute, and he is going to tell us something about all of those things, and we're going to try and condense that into our normal 10 to 12 minutes here. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, David, and I hope you don't mind me using your first name.
Absolutely not.
Okay, I appreciate that. I have a doctorate in neurobehavioral psychology, so just to be absolutely specific with that, but it is pretty much all the same. And so I think we just start off with, what does a neurobehavioral psychologist do? And I think what's just easiest to just take a brief paragraph from a definition. I have here: a behavioral neuroscientist examines the neuropsychological processes that serve as an undercurrent in functional relationships between behavior and the environment. So as a neurobehavioral psychologist, we are involved with a lot of multidiscipline departments, and it crosses a lot of boundaries that, in my experience and my background, have left gaps in communication with issues that may be interrelated. So in this segment, what we have done is tried to cross those gaps with not only the understanding of these disciplines, but it's also related to the science behind what we have developed, which is the emotional budget program.
So as I understand it from your website, is you work with children, adolescents, and adults, and that sounds like a pretty broad range. So there's no specific age limit to the services you provide.
Oh, absolutely not, David. This is one of the most important factors. To begin with, I think if we could just go back one moment and consider this the foundational process on which the others to be built. What I have, my experience with working with children and as a school psychologist, working in clinical situations, and also as someone who's been educated in clinical psychology, one of the important aspects of this was to develop something that provided across gender, across types, and the only way to really have done that is to work directly with the brain. Because in each individual, the brain is the function for the behavior. And because all our brains do similarly the same thing, then what we have developed is a science-backed program that works on every individual, because it's similarly working with the brain that has the similar functions around the globe.
And so what type of problems would your approach deal with? Like who is a typical client or patient?
Ironically, it's as varied as necessary, because it works with every individual. Every individual has a brain. Mm-hmm. So it reminds me of the Yellow Brick Road, in which the straw man is searching for his brain. And there is some irony in that. That is exactly what we are doing. We are searching for the brain as the foundation of function, which is the foundation of behavior. In other words, with our other departments, they have sometimes been focused on trying to change function with behavior. That in another institution, that we would call that incarceration. So when we incarcerate and we call it rehabilitation, we are looking to change function of the brain through what we would describe as modifying behavior. So when we try to modify behavior, we're trying to suggest that we are also changing a person's how they think, and what they're going to do. And we know that recidivism rates on average across the United States, although it may vary, is about 77%. In other words, only 23% actually come away with something that may be changed or not reoffend. And this is an indication that that is actually the rate at which, whether you incarcerate or not, or you try to change someone's behavior, you only have basically a 17 to 27% chance of having that person change his behavior. And this is across medication or alcohol and drug rehabilitation. Any kind of psychological counseling is still within that range. And that's from mega data research. And it also, unfortunately, is similar to if there's no treatment at all. Now, of course, there's anecdotal differences, there's this or that, but that's, if you look at it across all the scientific research, you come to that kind of conclusion.
Wow, fascinating. Paul, we're going to shift gears just a little bit and tell us about your book, The Emotional Budgeting Workbook, and who might be interested in reading that.
Okay, so we have, in regards to this whole process of the brain and working to change behavior through function, and that is the cognitive development, that's what this emotional budget workbook is aimed at. And we did it because it is actually the antidote. When the book Bipolar War and Autism Revolution is completed, those can be used as predictors because it describes the science behind that. And the science behind that is predictability, because you now know the assessment of an individual along these brain development. It is actually very predictable on people's behaviors. But rather than have that available for a few, we have gone to the antidote, which is the emotional budget workbook for every individual, because as every individual works through this book, it works on the brain. The brain utilizes the files, it works to build files for the emotional part of the brain, just as if we built financial files for ourselves to strategize and problem solve for money and financial planning. We have done that with the emotional portion of our thinking. And if we look back through history, no matter how far you go, you can see that things have been repetitive, except for in the finances. You see how financial development has changed our world, but we have done nothing for the emotional processing of our brain. And because of that, we now sit in what I would congratulate you, David, for trying to bring more information and saving America. But the underlying root here is the brain and behavior that follows. And in providing the brain an updated way to do what we've done with financial markets, we can do with emotional. In other words, stabilize our thinking, bring new perspectives in a scientific, repeatable manner across every individual who is not traumatic, does not have traumatic brain injury, and because every brain does the same work.
And Paul, we have limited time. This is obviously a fascinating topic. We could go for hours. You mentioned something that I was going to ask you about next, so I'm going to just key you in here. I know you have two books in process, one on bipolar and one on autism. Would you tell our listeners a little bit about those two and when we might find them available?
Yes, that is the conundrum of all of us who are busy.
Yes.
Yeah. And that is unfortunate, but it actually is working out in a strategic way, again, because the emotional budget workbook is important to provide free agency to our behaviors, because it's directly with the brain. If we're not working with the brain, it's not free agency. We are influenced by our environmental pressures. But by doing that, we provide the free agency, and the books Bipolar War and Autism Revolution were broken down into two parts, specifically because there's so much information. And that information explains the divergence, rather than autism and bipolar being simply a disability of mental health as a label. It actually, if we follow the behaviors, we can look at it as the outside part of the curve of a normal population in which these are shared behaviors all the way across the spectrums from bipolar to autism that can be shared. And the behaviors can be predicted and followed through the population curve. And obviously the ones that are to the far edges of the curve are those individuals who have the greatest difficulty in functioning. So when they have a problem functioning, then we tend to provide labels to that dysfunction because there's an issue. But rather than simply provide label as a disability, we can follow those behaviors and understand it and then provide the support as one. We might have glasses for those of us who can't see well. I would have a great disability and not be here today, David. And the same can be said for all of these mental health disabilities. The more we understand, the greater the support we can provide in having that individual be a part of society in a functional way.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, if people are interested in getting more information, what website would they go to?
They can obviously, we're all over the web. We have podcasts that really explain in 17 parts, Talk Revolution with Paul Sambataro. This is really broken down into specific areas that we just mentioned: bipolar, autism, ADD, many both in assessments and so on, and so many different areas, explains how this working with the brain through this workbook, emotional budgeting workbook. And we are working on having this explained either on YouTube or in some way available. So we will have an explanation to how the workbook should be going through, basically a guide. And that is what we're currently working on. And also we're working on other governmental agencies to provide them this same platform for mental health interventions.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. It's been wonderful to visit with you and give our viewers and listeners an opportunity to learn more about this important area. Certainly, the two things you've mentioned, bipolar is probably the most commonly diagnosed mental health issue in the United States today. And autism is a concern for many, many parents. And of course, autistic children become autistic adults in many cases. And so these are very important things for our society. And what a great fit for our concept called Saving America. And we hope our viewers and listeners will join us again. Take care. Bye-bye.